In the stillness of a mist-covered dawn, when the sky lay quietly asleep, and the last stars faded silently behind dense gray clouds, Maverick awoke. There was no voice calling, no alarm needed, just that fleeting moment when the sense of the world slipped gently through the crack of the SUV door parked in the empty lot, waking the sharpened instincts of a four-legged warrior. His nose, silent yet more powerful than any machine, began tirelessly processing. The scent of jet fuel infused in morning dew, the rubber soles of combat boots, the stale aroma of forgotten coffee in a discarded cup, all familiar. Yet hidden beneath these familiar smells was something faint, subtle, like a solitary breath lost among the known world, an elusive signal Maverick couldn't yet name. Still, it made his heart quicken slightly. Quietly, he stretched in the back compartment, muscles flexing smoothly and controlled like an athlete preparing for competition. Maverick did not bark or whine. Ordinary dogs would cry out to be let free, but he needed no such gestures. He had been trained and had taught himself that patience and silence could save more lives than meaningless noise. Turning his head towards the fog-covered window, the world appeared blurry and dreamlike, reminiscent of scenes from an old film reel. Pale yellow airport lights, helicopters standing quietly in line, shadowy figures drifting by. All stirred something deep within Maverick's memories. He hadn't always lived this disciplined life filled with respect and clear purpose. There had once been a time when Maverick was nothing but a quiet shadow trapped in a makeshift shelter. Those days stretched endlessly inside cold metal cages, the air saturated with spoiled food and dried waste, endless barking echoing in a chorus of desperation. Dogs around him fought and barked frantically for attention, yet Maverick merely sat, silently gazing outward. Not because he didn't want to be chosen, but because he knew that whoever he was waiting for wasn't just anyone passing by. He didn't need rescuing. He needed to be recognized. He vividly remembered one damp afternoon, rain pattering softly against the metal roof, the only companion a bowl of murky water and the hurried footsteps down the hallway. Then a man appeared. Unlike all others, he didn't seek out the loudest dog, but walked silently with weary, deep-set eyes. When those eyes met Maverick's, the world seemed to pause. Without a word, without a whistle, the man simply stopped, knelt, and gently reached through the bars. And Maverick, in one simple, decisive act, stepped forward. He pressed his nose softly into that warm palm, and at that moment, all fear, vigilance, and pain dissolved instantly. The man, Daniel Harris, made no promises, but his eyes spoke clearly. "I see you. I trust you. Let's walk forward together." From that moment on, Maverick was no longer dog number 32 in the shelter's records. He became part of something larger, a companion, a warrior, a courageous soul hidden beneath short brown fur and loyal eyes. Without being taught, Maverick understood clearly that his life was no longer about survival. It was about protection. This morning, as the fog thickened incrementally, Maverick breathed calmly and steadily, his eyes locked onto a familiar figure approaching. Daniel, his partner, mentor, and friend, prepared himself for a new day and a new mission. Yet Maverick sensed today would be unlike any other. Something was coming, and he was ready. As the last beads of dew clung to the hood of the vehicle and a faint line of light began to tear through the eastern sky, Daniel knelt beside Maverick, gently adjusting the chest strap of his dog's tactical vest. It was a familiar routine, one he had performed countless times. Yet each movement carried the focus of a man who saw his companion not as a pet, but as a comrade, a fellow warrior. Maverick stood still without command, his eyes following every motion of the man who had weathered with him countless training seasons, midnight chases, and long frozen hours standing guard in silence, waiting for signals over the radio that needed no words between them to be understood. Daniel didn't speak much, and Maverick never needed words. Between them existed a rare understanding, a connection that blurred the line between man and dog, forged not just through time, but through moments where instinct and trust had pulled them back from the edge between life and death. Maverick could feel Daniel's steady heartbeat as the leash clipped softly to his vest, and Daniel knew that look in Maverick's eyes, deep, quiet, but alert, meant his partner had switched into mission mode. Maverick wasn't just a dog trained to obey, he was a thinking being, one who read the world in ways humans couldn't, sensing changes in scent, wind patterns, even the way sound bounced off the ground. And this morning, despite the familiar setting and the familiar people, something felt off. He didn't bark or growl, didn't give any obvious signal, but something subtle sparked his instincts, like silent lightning flickering across a sky not yet dark with storm. As Daniel shut the truck door and they headed toward the hangar, Maverick lifted his head slightly higher, nose twitching in the wind. There was a new scent, fresh oil, untouched by the dust of time, like the well-worn engines they knew. Heated metal, not quite from airplane brakes, but not entirely foreign either, and layered under it all, a human scent that didn't belong. Tension, secrecy, buried within the smell of a technician's boots. It lasted only seconds, but to Maverick, it was as if a small fire had sparked deep in a forest that only he could sense. His gaze tracked a shadow slipping through the side door of the hangar, a place off limits at this hour. The man didn't even glance at Maverick, but Maverick had already memorized him. The smell of bitterness woven into the fabric of thick gloves reeking of engine grease. He didn't know the man's name was Ryan Denton. He didn't know about Denton's history in aviation, the failed contracts, or the grudges buried beneath quiet negotiations. But he knew one thing. That man didn't belong here. Meanwhile, Daniel was speaking with Mercer, the veteran pilot known for his discipline and his distrust of anything that couldn't be measured. Maverick heard their voices, but his eyes never left the door that had just slammed shut behind the stranger. After the final checks, Daniel leaned down and adjusted Maverick's special noise-canceling headset. "Let's get ready, warrior," he whispered, a faint smile crossing his lips. Maverick didn't respond, but his tail gave a slight wag, not from excitement, but as a sign. "I'm ready. Ready not just for another routine patrol, but for something more. Something his instincts screamed about, though he had no words to express it in any human language." They stepped into the hangar. Fluorescent lights lit everything in a calm, artificial brightness. But in Maverick's ears, the blend of rotor sounds didn't sit quite right. There was a vibration out of sync, a frequency that rippled with unease. No one else in the hangar seemed to notice, but Maverick was certain something was hidden here. And only a creature like him, born not just to follow, but to lead in silence, could sense it. Daniel's footsteps echoed faintly across the cold, concrete floor of the hangar. But to Maverick, that sound couldn't drown out something else, a strange scent that had just slipped through the door as the wind shifted. It lasted only a moment, vague and fleeting like a sudden thought, but for a warrior forged from instinct like him, that was all it took. He stopped in his tracks, his entire body tensing like a drawn bow, poised to snap. The wind had brought something that didn't belong, something foreign, unlike the familiar smell of jet fuel, the worn leather jackets of the tech crew, or the usual tang of hot metal. This scent was too new, too carefully masked, as if whoever created it had tried to wipe away all traces, not knowing that to a creature like Maverick, scent never truly disappears. It merely hides beneath the dust and smoke. Lowering his head, Maverick swept his nose gently along the floor where the wind had just passed. The smell clung there, a complex mix of specialty-grade engine oil, metal treatment chemicals, and the sweat of a human body in a high adrenaline state. He didn't know the names of these things, but he understood what they meant. The scent of interference, of a machine twisted in the wrong direction, of hands gripping something with unnatural force. Maverick had been trained to detect explosives, gas leaks, even shifts in material composition. But this was different. The danger wasn't in the thing itself, but in the intent behind it. Across the hangar, a man in a dark blue technician uniform moved quickly toward the side door, gripping a toolbox tightly, head low. He didn't look around, but his movements were too fast, too precise, like someone keeping to a schedule. He passed the flight team like a shadow, leaving no footprints but leaving a scent. Maverick didn't move. He stood still, frozen, ears high, eyes locked on the door that had just clicked shut behind the man. Daniel was up ahead, deep in conversation with the tactical crew and lead pilot about the route map. Others were busy running diagnostics on the communication systems. No one noticed the man who'd just walked out, and no one noticed what Maverick did. The smell of a twisted motive hidden beneath a legal disguise. His throat tightened, a reflex he had whenever danger edged closer. It wasn't fear. It was a primal alertness, like a wolf in an ancient forest who's just heard the faintest snap of a branch behind him. Maverick glanced at Daniel, but didn't move closer. He couldn't speak. He couldn't point. All he had was instinct, a body trained to stand at the edge of trust and suspicion, and eyes deep and still as windless air, enough to tell a man, if he dared look, that he had already been sensed. Not far off, the Bell 429 helicopter was going through its final checks. The rotors stood still, and the glossy black body shimmered faintly under the hangar lights, reflecting the blurred figures of busy humans. No one thought anything was wrong, because they had eyes but no nose like Maverick's. To them, it was just another hectic morning. But to him, this was the start of something off, a fracture in the harmony of scent, sound, and motion, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. Daniel turned back, gently tapping Maverick's neck to signal it was time to board. Maverick gave a slight nod, but the scent still lingered in his mind, stubborn as an unanswered question. And this time, he wasn't going to turn away like he had with other vague suspicions. This time, the scent carried blood. Not blood that was spilling, but blood that would, if no one listened to a dog. The strange wind carrying the scent of danger hadn't fully faded by the time Maverick and Daniel moved deeper into the helicopter bay, where massive blocks of metal lined up like steel beasts waiting to launch into the gloomy sky. Footsteps echoed, tools clinked and clicked, voices wove in and out among the technical crews, all of it blending into the cold, cavernous space like a symphony of preparation. On the surface, everything seemed routine. But Maverick couldn't relax. He didn't see with his eyes or hear with his ears the way humans did. He sensed the world through a layer of perception built from scent and chemical emotion, a record of reality written in smell. Each helicopter had its distinct odor, a kind of invisible fingerprint only beings like Maverick could recognize. It was a mix of scorched metal, engine oil aged by hundreds of flight hours, warm composite resin, and the human traces of those who had flown inside. Maverick had been trained to analyze these smells as part of survival. Over time, he developed a sensitivity sharper than any electronic scanner, the ability to detect something out of place in what should have felt familiar. And this morning, something was wrong again. But it wasn't the machines. It was a man. Maverick sensed him before he saw him. His scent arrived first, threading through the cracks in the wind and brushing against Maverick's nose like a suspicious whisper. This wasn't the scent of a typical technician. Those carried the earthy blend of oil, dust, and the honest sweat of physical labor. This one reeked of intent. Cheap cologne masking something deeper, a trace of industrial solvent leaking through gloves, the faint iron tinge of old blood, and the stress sweat of a man on high alert. It was the scent of someone who had done something wrong and was trying too hard to seem calm. Maverick slowed as his eyes finally found him. A tall man in a dark gray technician's jacket, toolkit pressed to his hip, cap pulled low, gaze avoiding contact. He didn't move incorrectly. He ran his checks, went through the motions. But there was something about the way he moved. Too calculated, too deliberate, like someone trying not to be noticed and achieving exactly the opposite. When he turned, his eyes flicked toward Maverick. Just for a moment, just a few seconds. But that look said everything. Guarded, challenging, and just barely afraid. To Maverick, it was a look he couldn't mistake. He'd seen it before, in men with hidden weapons, in smugglers at border gates, in attackers moments before they made their move. It wasn't a look between man and dog. It was the silent recognition between two predators who had just identified each other in a crowd, and both knew a confrontation was inevitable. Maverick didn't bark. He didn't growl. That would have broken the fragile order of things and earned him the label of an unprovoked animal. Instead, he stayed still, locking that face in his memory, a mark he would not forget. Daniel was still speaking with Mercer, the pilot, about shifting weather conditions and the updated flight plan. No one noticed the silent exchange that had just passed between Maverick and the stranger. No one knew that in those few seconds, a four-legged creature had detected a threat that every checklist, every maintenance log, every hour of human preparation had failed to catch. His name was Ryan Denton, a former aerospace engineer suspended for violating safety protocols. Once employed by a rival contractor who lost their bid with the Portland Police Department, he had motive, access, and the technical knowledge to engineer an accident no one could trace back immediately. But Maverick didn't know any of that. He didn't need a file or a motive. All he needed was the smell, and Denton's scent was the clearest confession of all. Among the silent helicopters waiting to awaken, among the people who still believed everything was as it should be, only one creature knew something was off, and that danger was walking around in a human shell, wearing gloves, carrying a toolbox, and hiding behind eyes that didn't match the rest of his face. Maverick didn't know when it would happen, but he knew one thing with absolute certainty. When steel breaks, it's not the sound that comes first, it's the smell, and he would be the first to catch it. As Ryan Denton disappeared behind the steel door at the far end of the hangar, leaving behind what looked like nothing more than ordinary space, Maverick remained in place. His eyes, still and focused, seemed to pierce the air, as if trying to lift an invisible veil and trace something no one else could sense. The helicopters lay dormant like sleeping beasts, their polished steel bodies reflecting the pale, sterile light overhead. To human eyes, they were symbols of power, engineering, and safety. But to Maverick, these machines carried something more uncertain. Not a shape, not a sound, but a disturbance in the scent of a world he had lived in, trained in, and learned to decode to protect the lives around him. He turned to glance at Daniel, who was speaking with the lead pilot and technical officers near the other side of the aircraft bay, then scanned the entire hangar. No one called for him. No one noticed that he had stood still for nearly a full minute, not moving a single paw. To them, Maverick was just another part of the K-9 unit, a tool to be used when needed, a biological device with fur and four legs. But Maverick had never seen himself as a tool, nor had he ever behaved like a machine that blindly followed orders. He was a creature with awareness, with choice. And right now, his choice was clear. Stay. Watch. Remember. Refuse to move forward while danger still lingered in the air. The wind slipped across the cold concrete floor, carrying the familiar smells of engine oil, melted plastic from a test-burned wire, and the sweat of men pushing equipment carts. But layered beneath all of it was a strange thread of scent, like a red thread woven through a gray rug, subtle yet impossible to ignore. Maverick had smelled something like it once before, during a high-level training exercise, when a simulated bomb shard had been hidden deep within the suspension system of a mock vehicle. It wasn't the smell of explosives exactly, but of stressed materials, metal distorted under mechanical force, structural bonds shattered by unnatural pressure. It was the scent of wounded steel. He didn't know what had happened. There was no explosion, no telltale crack of metal breaking. But Maverick's entire body, From the way his toes subtly gripped the floor to the measured rhythm of his heartbeat, was sending a single message. Something invisible had shifted in the world, and if it wasn't stopped, it would become disaster. Maverick didn't rush toward Daniel. He didn't charge the helicopter undergoing final checks. He simply stood there, like a fixed point in space, a lone sentinel holding the line between calm and chaos. No one assigned him that role, but he took it anyway, because he wasn't just a working dog. He was the product of thousands of hours of training, of failure and correction, of tests that allowed no margin for error. And above all, he was the embodiment of something no machine could replicate, unwavering trust in his instinct. Far in the distance, Ryan Denton cast one last glance over his shoulder before vanishing into the restricted maintenance wing, as if he too could feel a pair of eyes locked onto him. He saw nothing but busy technicians, but somewhere deep in his gut, maybe something stirred, some primitive instinct that never quite dies in men who've crossed ethical lines too many times, and if he had looked more carefully, he would have seen it. A creature that never looked away, a soul that spoke no words yet was quietly writing the indictment against him. Among all the weapons, technology, and armed personnel, there stood one figure carrying nothing but a nose and loyalty, and yet that was enough to mark the line between life and death. At that moment, Maverick didn't need recognition. He didn't need validation. He knew. He was the final gatekeeper of life. No one noticed him, and that was exactly how he stopped the worst from happening. Maverick's silence wasn't submission. It was a voice being overlooked. When the signal horn blared to announce the final drill before takeoff, the hangar shifted into high gear. Equipment was checked, orders relayed over radios, teams moved into formation with practiced precision, everything unfolding like a well-oiled machine. But in that world of rhythm and routine, only one being refused to fall in line: Maverick. Daniel called his name, calm but firm, as he began walking toward the helicopter assigned for the upcoming mission. Maverick followed, but not like he usually did. He didn't trot eagerly at Daniel's side. He didn't scan the area with his usual alertness. His steps were heavy, quiet, as if each one pushed against the weight of his instinct. And when he was just a few paces from the aircraft's body, where the scent of metal thickened, fused with an off-kilter layer of fresh oil, he stopped, then stepped back. Just one step. Small, unassuming. But for Maverick, it tilted his whole world for a single, sharp moment. He could feel it clearly. The scent wasn't that of intact steel, but of wounded metal, subtle and cold, like the deep ache of a bone fracture hidden beneath unbroken skin. Something had been tampered with, a joint over-tightened, a component slightly off its axis. The smell wasn't as blatant as explosives or gas, but it was just as potent to him, buried in the ordinary, threading through a structure meant to be flawless. And more than that, hidden within it still lingered a trace of the man Maverick had already committed to memory. The scent of Ryan Denton, who had exited maintenance through a door not meant for unauthorized personnel. Maverick turned his head to look at Daniel, eyes deep and tense. It wasn't a look asking for directions. It was a silent plea. But Daniel, drawn into the current of responsibility and his trust in human systems, only glanced at him for a few seconds before checking the leash, interpreting Maverick's hesitation as a normal response to the noise. And Maverick heard it, clear as glass, the soft laughter from a group of technicians nearby. "Maybe he's just spooked by the rotors," one joked. "Or tired," another added with a chuckle, laced with misplaced pity. "These canines aren't machines, after all." Daniel hesitated, just for a moment, then gently tightened the leash and urged Maverick forward. Maverick didn't resist. He never resisted Daniel, but each step felt like crossing a field that had just cracked beneath its green surface, a fracture only creatures close to the ground, close to the wind, could feel. He didn't bark. He didn't lash out. He had learned that noise only clouded human senses, but something inside him closed, the door of safety, when the first warning was dismissed for lacking technical evidence. He followed Daniel like a soldier still loyal to the end, but those steps no longer carried confidence, only a tight, silent dread. Not fear for himself, but for every life that would soon step onto that aircraft. Maverick didn't need anyone to confirm his suspicion. He just needed one person to believe. But that morning, while the wind carried the scent of fractured steel and people focused only on timelines and checklists, no one listened to the one being who had smelled the truth, a dog standing still in his own shadow, carrying a silent warning, left behind in the vast hangar. And it was in that silence that tragedy began to take shape. A silent blade tucked beneath the cloak of routine, waiting for the final trigger to release it. Maverick didn't know when it would happen, but he knew without doubt that what he smelled that morning was not meaningless. And this time, if no one would stop and listen, he would make them. Maverick kept his eyes locked on the sleek black helicopter in the middle of the field, as if that stare alone could stop whatever was silently moving beneath its cold metal shell. He didn't know its name. He didn't know where, exactly, the flaw hid within its complex body. But his instincts told him something was rotting inside, something waiting for the right moment to betray the trust humans placed in these lifeless machines. He had stepped back during the drill, a small, quiet act no one understood, no one bothered to question, and the slow shake of the commander's head had felt like a final door closing on his chance to prove what he sensed was real. After the briefing, Daniel was pulled aside. The conversation was quiet, but Maverick caught the tension in the superior officer's voice. Words like unacceptable hesitation, absolute flight cohesion, and "we can't let a dog undermine protocol at the final hour." Daniel remained calm, but his hand tightening on Maverick's leash gave him away. He argued with a steady, low voice, referencing Maverick's spotless service record, the missions they'd completed together, the time Maverick had detected a toxic leak a gas sensor missed, the explosive buried in a trunk beneath a pile of household waste. But to the ones making the call, those were just stories from the past, and they weren't willing to stake the future of an important operation on a dog's instinct. The final decision came. Maverick was grounded. He would not be on the flight. The official term was a disciplinary precaution, but to Maverick it meant something deeper, being pushed beyond the boundary where he could do what he was born and trained to do: protect. Daniel returned to him, looking him straight in the eyes, saying nothing. Maverick didn't meet his gaze. Instead, he looked back toward the helicopter, where the pilots were running their final checks, where the rotors were beginning to turn slowly, like life stirring in a machine no one realized was fractured. Not from where, but from a hand that had intentionally created that fracture, now hidden under polished paint, waiting for altitude and turbulence to spring the trap. Across the field, Ryan Denton stood among the tech crew, toolbox slung over one shoulder, gestures smooth and unremarkable. He didn't look at Maverick, but Maverick never looked away. His scent, once muffled by oil and sweat, was now sharp and exposed. The scent of satisfaction, the scent of a fox that had just slipped out of the chicken coop unnoticed. Denton wasn't rushing. He didn't need to. He knew the only one who had sensed him had been removed. He knew no one else would see the small thing he had done, and he knew the accident wouldn't happen right away. In Maverick's mind, training sessions flickered back like a slow reel of film. He remembered being unleashed in mock warehouses, always finding the hidden gas leak, always sitting calmly when he discovered the explosive hidden behind concrete. He remembered Daniel's proud gaze, the one that always said, "I trust you, no matter what anyone else thinks." But today, Maverick had no chance to sit. No one asked. No one allowed him to act. He had been pulled from the stage like a faulty prop, even though he knew the play was heading toward chaos, and no one saw what he had already seen. Daniel led him to a restroom, a plain holding space beside the operations block. Maverick walked in, but he didn't lie down. He didn't rest. He stood by the small window, staring out at the airfield, where the helicopter neared its final phase of preparation. The scent of danger hadn't faded with time. It had thickened, like smoke in a room with no ventilation. He stood like stone, muscles taut with every heartbeat, as if he were ready to spring at any moment. And truthfully, he was. He was just waiting for the precise moment to break the silence humans had imposed on him. Outside, the helicopter let out a low growl, its final confirmation that the mission was about to begin. And Maverick knew, with everything in him, with instinct, with experience, with the loyalty forged through years of training and trust, that if he couldn't be on that helicopter, then he would stop it from taking off. From behind the foggy glass of the control room, Maverick kept his eyes on the helicopter's every move, like a soldier exiled from the battlefield, but never laying down his weapon. He stood there for hours, motionless, unblinking, willing, as if by sheer force of will, to stop the wheels of fate from rolling toward the edge of disaster. Then, like fate shifting in real time, a voice crackled through the radio. Urgent, clipped, and enough to throw the whole operations center into sudden motion. K9 Delta injured while inspecting the loading ramp, swelling in the hind leg, unfit for duty. The once quiet room erupted. The commander frowned. Internal lines lit up. Assignment boards flickered on screen. Less than 30 minutes remained before takeoff, and now the air security team was short a working dog with no immediate replacement in sight. A rapid review of the standby K9 units in the area yielded nothing. Most were too far away, or not trained for a mission of this level. Then, as a last resort, the name Maverick surfaced again. Not with hope, not with faith, just as a weary exhale, like someone picking up a dulled blade when no other weapon remained. The commander looked toward Daniel, who sat quietly beside Maverick. "Can you bring your dog back?" It sounded like a concession, but Daniel knew better. It was a crack in the door, just wide enough for the moment they'd both been waiting for. Daniel didn't reply. He simply stood, unhooked the leash, and bent down toward Maverick. No command, no hand signal, but Maverick understood. He rose to his feet and strode out of the room like a warrior reinstated to his rightful place, not barking, not looking back, heading straight toward the waiting helicopter with eyes locked on its metal frame, as if he could still smell the silent danger leaking from within. He knew, deep within that steel shell, something was waiting for the right moment to betray the humans on board. Out on the runway, the air had shifted. The rotors spun lazily at first, the reflective tape fluttering wildly in the wind like a heartbeat speeding up. Technicians rushed through final checks. No one noticed Maverick at first, until someone on the team caught sight of him walking beside Daniel and called out, "Isn't that the dog who got cut this morning?" There was no malice in the voice, but doubt clung to every word. A few heads turned, their eyes questioning what a rejected dog was doing back here. To them, Maverick was a last-ditch substitute, a stand-in for a machine that had just failed. But Maverick didn't care. He wasn't here for approval, and he didn't need a welcome. He only needed to be in the right place, at the right time, to do what he was born to do. Stop evil before it struck. He stood just feet from the ramp, the helicopter towering ahead. And once again, that strange metallic scent hit him, stronger than it had been in the morning. It wasn't just the smell of structural damage. It was the smell of intent, of human hands making a deliberate mistake, then covering it up with practiced calm. Ryan Denton, quietly packing tools near the maintenance bay, didn't glance at Maverick, but his shoulder twitched, a reflex only prey recognizes in those being watched. Maverick stayed still, head tilted slightly, eyes etching the man's outline into memory. He didn't need to lunge. He didn't need to bark. His presence alone was a living warning to the traitor. "I'm back, and this time I won't let you disappear in silence." Daniel knelt beside him, resting a hand on his head in silent gratitude. In his eyes, there was still the uncertainty of a man pushed out of decisions, but also the unshakable trust in the instincts of the creature before him. He didn't need Maverick to prove anything. He just needed him there, like always, where a glance, a backward step, or a pause in breath could mean the difference between life and death. And so Maverick returned to the front line. Not with medals, not with fanfare, but with silence, with scent, with a honed instinct born of every mission before, and with a loyalty that no force could break. His return drew no cheers, no announcements over loudspeakers, but it marked the first step toward a truth waiting to be revealed. And he knew there would be no next time. This was it. This time, he had to make them believe. The rotor blades above roared louder as the engine fired up for the third time, making the air around the helicopter tremble, like an underground current suddenly breaking the surface. Maverick, now close to the ramp, placed one paw on the cold metal edge. Then he stopped. It wasn't the noise, it wasn't hesitation, it was something else. An old feeling, familiar but haunting, rising suddenly in his chest. The air here was different. Heavy, thick, and laced with the scent of something long suppressed, now on the verge of rupture. The backdraft from the rotors swept across his face, carrying with it a mix of warming metal under engine pressure, fresh lubricant, and a faint chemical trace. The smell of warped material, of steel fracturing from within, breaking apart molecule by molecule. It wasn't just one detail, it was the sum of everything. The slight, uneven tremble of the door, the barely misaligned ramp floor, even the way the helicopter's scent no longer matched the memory burned into his mind from hundreds of past missions. Maverick took a step back, then another, and stopped. His body stretched taut like a string pulled to its breaking point, ears perked, nose twitching, sorting through layers of overlapping smells like a biological codebreaker following a buried signal. Daniel turned, alarm flashing in his eyes as he saw Maverick freeze in the middle of the ramp, a space that should have taken just one more step to cross. It should have been routine, like every other time. But Daniel had been with him long enough to know. Maverick never stopped without a reason. "Mav?" Daniel called softly, stepping closer, gently tugging the leash. No response. Only that gaze, fixed deep into the heart of the aircraft, as if he were seeing through the layers of steel, wires, gears, and bolts, to a single point no one else could reach. A place that held something wrong, something broken, something that had no place in a mission carrying human lives. Maverick sat down, not cowering, not barking, not panicked like a dog scared of sound. He simply sat, quiet, but firm, like a message written into the DNA of a warrior. "I've detected a threat. Stop. Do not move forward." The air seemed to slow. A few officers in the flight crew glanced at each other. Someone muttered, "What now?" Another sighed. Probably just reacting to the noise again. A few nervous chuckles followed. People who didn't understand, didn't want to understand, or didn't have the time, because to them, a dog refusing to board a helicopter never outweighed a flight planned weeks in advance. But Daniel understood. His confusion gave way to tension. He remembered a mission 3 months ago. Maverick had done the same thing, refusing to enter a cargo zone after detecting a chemical leak from a mislabeled container. 3 airport staff avoided severe poisoning that day because of him. He also remembered a training session last year when Maverick refused to get into a cleared vehicle. Later, they found trace amounts of explosive residue undetectable by any machine. Maverick had never been wrong. And this time, his eyes didn't just reject, they warned. Daniel crouched, placing a hand on Maverick's neck. Their eyes met. "You're sensing it that strongly?" he whispered, voice low and tight. Maverick didn't answer. He didn't need to. His eyes did, clear enough to trigger old memories. Nights spent waiting in armored vehicles, jumps into storms from helicopters, moments when life and death hung by a breath. And Daniel knew, When a dog like Maverick refuses to step forward, it's not out of fear. It's because something is waiting to kill. Not far off, Ryan Denton still stood near the edge of the tarmac, half hidden behind a stack of equipment. He glanced toward the ramp, where the brown dog sat locked in place, eyes fierce. Ryan's grip tightened on the handle of his toolbox. Sweat beaded on his temples. Time was running out. He had planned everything. The misdirected maintenance, the hairline crack introduced into the tail rotor's control system, precisely where it wouldn't be visible and nearly impossible to detect without disassembly. It was all calculated to fail at just the right altitude, high enough that no one would survive, low enough that no one would question a technical failure. What he didn't count on was the one thing he couldn't measure: a nose, an instinct, a creature that didn't trust checklists. Daniel tightened the leash, not to pull Maverick forward, but to place himself between the dog and the helicopter. He stood, turned, and spoke clearly, without hesitation. "We're stopping. Something's wrong. Check the tail system, everything. I won't let anyone board this flight until it's done." Silence. A long pause, long enough to change everything. And Maverick stayed seated, still, yet somehow roaring with every fiber of his being, every blazing sense ignited by pure instinct. Stop. Death is very close. The silence that followed Daniel's declaration stretched out like a vacuum between grinding gears, then shattered, swept away by the thunder of rotor blades crashing against the concrete and the uneasy, frustrated glances of those around. Daniel crouched beside Maverick, his hand gently resting on the leash. His voice was low and steady, like a breath carried by the wind. "Come on, Mav. If I'm wrong, I'll take responsibility." But Maverick didn't move forward. He stepped back. Once. Then again. His ears were up, his spine tight like an arrow drawn to its limit, his back arched slightly, every muscle beneath his brown coat taut with tension. His entire body screamed alert. He was a drawn bowstring stretched to the edge. The strange feeling in the air was no longer a hunch. It had become a certainty. Every nerve in Maverick's body was firing, every instinct blazing red like a warning light after an unseen impact that only he could sense. He didn't need evidence. He didn't need validation. His instinct was the evidence, and this time it stood in direct conflict with command. Eyes began to turn toward them. Angry footsteps echoed across the concrete, followed by a sharp voice from the flight operations team. "We're 7 minutes behind. We need to clear the ramp now." Another officer, head of flight safety, approached with a voice heavy with impatience. "Anomalous dog behavior warrants a check, but not a full stop. Maverick was removed from the mission this morning. His return was a courtesy, not a right." His gaze landed on Daniel like a quiet warning. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He looked down at Maverick, still unmoving, breathing slow but deep, eyes fixed on the helicopter. And in that moment, amid raised voices, radio chatter about weather conditions, wind speeds, and flight paths, a silent confrontation played out, not between people, but between a loyal, four-legged soul and a cold, rigid system of orders. Ryan Denton, standing behind the equipment case, clutched his work phone tight. His eyes flicked from Maverick to Daniel, then to the helicopter's tail, where he had tampered with the mechanics just nights before, disguised as a certified technician, smiling, tools in hand, every move rehearsed. Sweat soaked through the inner lining of his shirt, but he didn't dare wipe it. He knew, as long as that dog stood there, he wasn't safe. In Maverick's mind, the thrum of the rotors couldn't drown out the memory. Memories of other missions, other warnings, when he smelled death before explosions, when he pulled a child from a locked car moments before toxic gas filled the cabin, when he dragged Daniel out of a warehouse seconds after gas leaked, even as detectors still read safe. This time, the feeling was stronger. This time, the smell of breaking steel had passed the warning stage. It was an emergency. A young officer stepped forward, reaching for the leash, only to freeze when Maverick let out a low, rumbling growl. Not aggressive, not panicked, just enough to stop the hand in midair. A sound like a lone wolf. Not threatening, but unmistakably clear. "Don't touch me. I'm doing what's right." The tension was thick. One of the flight supervisors whispered, "We don't have time for this superstition. That plane leaves in 10 minutes, or the governor's entire schedule collapses." Another added, "If this continues, we'll have him removed." Daniel turned. For the first time that morning, his eyes were cold. Sharp. "If Maverick refuses to board, I won't get on either. You can remove me, but I will file a formal report demanding a full inspection of the tail rotor before takeoff, and I'll state the reason clearly. Canine alert. Critical level." Again, silence. But this time it wasn't doubtful. It was deliberate. A pause to reconsider. Because there were people there who had seen Maverick work before, who'd watched him pick out a faint chemical odor in a sea of conflicting data, who'd seen him sit without fail over a fake bomb hidden beneath 3 layers of soundproof casing. Those people were no longer certain. One officer murmured to his colleague, "That dog's never been wrong, not once." And so Maverick, without barking, without bolting, without breaking command, brought an entire system to a halt. Not because he was extraordinary, but because, in a world ruled by protocol, instinct is sometimes the only thing still tethered to the truth. He didn't move forward, didn't step back. He just stood there, like a final barrier between rushed decisions and the disaster quietly waiting beneath polished metal. The air was thick, like morning fog soaked in sunlight, and the rotors above kept spinning, screeching like an unspoken countdown. Daniel stood on the ramp, right at the edge of the aircraft, feeling the weight pressing in from all sides, eyes fixed on him like hidden needles beneath crisp uniforms, murmurs blaming delays on him, radios echoing with words like timing, responsibility, consequences. And now his superior officer striding over from the operations tent, staring at him as if he'd lost his grip on reality. But amid all the noise, Daniel could only hear one thing, loud and steady like a drumbeat from within his chest: Maverick's breathing. It wasn't the calm breath of a dog watching the world. It was the breath of instinct set ablaze, of a soul that had once sniffed out death in the wind and pulled life back from the edge. Daniel lowered his gaze, his fingers tightening around the leash that had become as familiar to him as his breath. He knew, if he tugged it even gently, Maverick would step forward, just like always. No resistance, no rebellion. He would obey. But Daniel also knew, if Maverick was refusing this time, then something was deeply wrong beneath that perfect metal skin. Something no machine could detect, no report could note, no human dared confirm, except for one dog. So he let go. No tug, no command, just a release. A quiet act of trust that defied every rule, every protocol pressing in around him. Maverick lifted his head and met Daniel's eyes for a brief moment. It lasted half a breath, but Daniel would remember it forever. That look didn't ask for approval. It didn't wait for confirmation. It was the look of a soldier being handed the authority to decide the fate of the entire unit. Without another second of hesitation, Maverick left the ramp. No bark, no rush, just movement. Swift, precise. His nose dropped low, tracing every current of air across the ground like he was reading invisible lines no one else could see. Each step rewound memory, past missions, ignored warnings, near misses, and the lives saved because of him. No one told him what to do, but the people around began to step aside, creating a small corridor as he moved like a shadow through wind and steel. Some held their breath. Someone whispered, "What's he doing?" Another scoffed, "Is this more theatrics?" But no one stopped him, because even if they didn't say it aloud, they felt it too. Something about Maverick's movement made it impossible to look away. He circled the tail of the aircraft, where all technical checks had cleared, where every bolt had been tightened, every hinge oiled to spec. But he knew. Numbers might say, fine, but reality didn't always match data. The strange scent from earlier was sharper now, present like a crack in the air's very fabric. And then he stopped. at the junction where the tail rotor met the main body. A tiny point no one had paid attention to, but the place where stability meets catastrophe. Maverick inhaled deeply. The lubricant, wrongly mixed, the alloy, decaying from the inside, and the scent of human hands. Not the regular technicians, but someone unfamiliar, someone wearing industrial gloves that still left behind a signature, a trace he'd caught that morning. The smell of Ryan Denton. Maverick sat down. The highest level alert posture in the entire K9 system. No sound, no expression, but clearer than any warning light or sensor could ever be. Daniel stepped forward. He didn't ask questions, didn't check. He just turned, and his voice rang out, firm, unwavering for the first time all morning. Reinspect the tail rotor. Right now. The commander started to protest, but a seasoned technician held up a hand. I saw that dog do the same thing 2 years ago, back in Redmond, and that time he was right. We have 2 choices now. Check it again, or gamble with fate. The order was given. Maverick stayed seated, eyes fixed on the aircraft like he was guarding something no one else could see. He didn't care how much they trusted him. He didn't care who doubted him. He only needed one thing, a chance to be heard. And Daniel, in that one moment, gave it to him, by choosing to stand with a creature who had no voice, but had never once been wrong. Wind swept hard across the runway, carrying with it the scent of engine oil, freshly cut morning grass, and somewhere in the current, the faint trace of sweat from soldiers standing still, frozen before something they couldn't yet see, but were beginning to feel more clearly through the silent presence of a dog. Maverick, after giving him his first warning, didn't repeat it. He didn't need to. He rose slowly, calmly, and glided toward the helicopter's body, beginning a hunt no one else could join. A hunt invisible to the eye but crystal clear to instinct. No urgency, no orders. Each step was an act of analysis. His nose sifted through air as it skimmed the metal body, separating molecules, processing each into a scent map more vivid than any blueprint. He had once smelled a melting wire before it caught fire, once detected explosives hidden inside a sealed tire, once sat down without hesitation at the edge of a room because of faint traces of toxic gas, while every detector stayed silent. Now, all that memory, all that experience, gathered in every breath as he neared the helicopter's tail, the place where the wind screamed loudest and metal scents were most easily masked by the engine's heat. He moved closer to the frame, head tilting slightly, nose aimed at a tiny seam no different to the human eye than hundreds of others. But here, something was off. The alloy's scent wasn't whole, not like new steel, not like rusted metal. It was altered, something warped under torque, lubricant tainted with impurities, and threaded through it all, the scent of human hands. Not the regular mechanic, not someone who knew this aircraft by feel. A stranger, the smell of new rubber gloves, too harsh industrial cleaner, chemical residue on the bolts, none of which belonged on a helicopter prepped to carry a governor into a potential riot zone. Maverick moved a few steps more, following the invisible scent trail like a thin smear of blood across concrete. Each step cut through the thickest disguise mankind had ever built. Blind confidence in technical reports. And then, he stopped, at the junction between the tail and the thrust control system. A single failure here, and the aircraft would lose balance mid-air. Silence, stillness. Then he sat. No sound, no wasted motion. Only a posture, the highest alert level in all of K9 protocol. Daniel approached slowly, as if afraid to disrupt the stillness that now cloaked Maverick. He'd seen this posture before, 3 times. Every time was urgent, and every time Maverick had been right. A bomb hidden in a fuse box, toxic gas in a refrigerated truck. A knife was lodged behind a seat at a political rally. But this time, Maverick's eyes weren't cautious. They were certain. Daniel gave the signal. The maintenance crew moved in, began removing panels near the point Maverick had marked. Some were skeptical. Others glanced at each other, silent but swayed. And then, when the third metal panel came off, a young technician gasped, "Holy hell!" and the team surged forward. There, deep inside the control cluster, was a hairline crack stretching along the shaft, hidden beneath the protective casing. Too fine for external inspection. Small, delicate, and deadly, because it was the crack in the tail rotor's drive shaft. If left undetected, even minor turbulence could throw the rotor out of sync, sending the helicopter spinning and crashing from the sky like a stone. "Incredible," an older engineer whispered. "It smelled the metal breaking?" Someone else added, "Not just the metal. It smelled of betrayal." From a distance, Ryan Denton stood frozen, his eyes locked on Maverick. Not with anger, but disbelief. He had planned it all perfectly. He'd worked at night, used the correct tools, and calculated the torque. He knew the fracture would be invisible unless the whole system was disassembled. He believed everyone would trust the maintenance reports. But he'd forgotten one thing. A dog doesn't read reports. It reads the world by scent. Maverick remained seated. Still, quiet. No pride, no demand for praise. He only glanced at Daniel, his eyes calm, like the surface of water after a storm. The hunt was over. There were no sirens, no chase. But a hidden assassination attempt had just been exposed, not by machines, not by command systems, but by scent, by instinct, and by trust. The lives of many, the governor, the flight crew, the security team, had been saved. Not by protocol, not by advanced tech, but by a silent dog sitting before death, and a man who dared to unclip the leash between obedience and instinct. Maverick's seat wasn't something humans could easily explain. It wasn't obedience. It wasn't the robotic outcome of hundreds of hours of training. It wasn't the behavior of an animal conditioned to expect rewards. It was a choice, a pinpoint, an unspoken declaration born of raw instinct. Danger was here, right here, at the junction between the helicopter's tail and body, a place no one, not even seasoned engineers, had stopped to question. He sat still, head straight, gaze sharp as a blade, fixed directly on the epicenter of risk. He didn't look around, didn't seek approval. He didn't bark, didn't growl, just stared, his eyes holding an urgency most humans aren't trained to notice. But today, those eyes were impossible to ignore. In that gaze was a silent alarm that brought technicians and crew alike to a halt, freezing mid-motion, as if something had suddenly slipped outside the expected order. A single dog, without a word, had silenced an entire airfield with the gravity of his stillness. The flight safety commander, the same man who had barked orders to clear the ramp just 15 minutes earlier, now stepped forward slowly, his face showing the rare hesitation of someone used to control, but now caught off balance. He looked at Daniel, then Maverick, toward the area the dog refused to look away from. "What's there?" he asked, more to himself than anyone else. But no one answered, because no one could answer. Only Maverick, motionless, unblinking, kept his eyes fixed on a space invisible to sight and sound, but dense with the scent of betrayal hanging in the air. The senior engineer, someone who had repaired hundreds of helicopters in his lifetime, approached the frame slowly. He bent down and placed a trembling hand on the section Maverick had marked. He said nothing, but his eyes narrowed the moment his fingertips detected the tiniest disturbance. Something barely there, like a pressure shift between two metal plates that should have been perfectly flush. Without a word, he signaled the team. Panels were removed. Screws loosened. Layers of sealant peeled back one by one, each like a lie being stripped away, layer by layer, revealing something never meant to be found. And then, as the final cover came off, a sharp breath broke the silence. "There's a crack deep." It was hair-thin, like a scratch across glass, but it reached straight into the structural heart of the tail rotor's control system. Under normal flight conditions, it might have lasted a few more hours, but with one wrong gust, A sharp turn or a sudden thrust. It would snap, and the tail would shear off. The helicopter would spiral out of the sky. No one would survive. Everyone stood frozen. Some cursed under their breath. Others covered their mouths. But Maverick didn't move. He remained where he was, eyes still locked on the spot now laid bare, like a scar from a plan that never quite succeeded. No one needed to give the order, but everyone stepped back. The chief engineer immediately called off the mission and ordered the aircraft moved to the analysis hangar. Internal investigators were activated within minutes, beginning a full audit of maintenance logs, security footage, and access records from the last 72 hours. No one said the words, but everyone knew. This wasn't an accident. This was sabotage, an attempted assassination, a deliberate act. Ryan Denton, watching as the cracked alloy panel was pulled free, said nothing, but something shifted in his eyes. He turned to walk away, but a security officer stepped into his path. "Where are you going?" the soldier asked. Not loudly, but firmly. Ryan swallowed, forced a smile. "I was just getting coffee." But the cold sweat around his collar, the fresh grease on his cuffs, and the trace chemicals clinging to his skin, Maverick had remembered them all. There was no need to chase. Maverick simply tilted his head, ears alert, her eyes locked again on the man trying to disappear into silence. This time, no one looked away. They had seen enough. They understood. And more importantly, they believed. Pinpointed. No error, no dramatics, no wasted breath. Maverick, a wordless soldier, had done what no surveillance system, no protocol, no manual ever could. He had found the fracture, in the metal, and in the trust of men. And it all began with a look, a seat, and an instinct that had never failed. As Maverick's eyes closed, offering a final, wordless confirmation, the engineering team moved silently to dismantle the tail rotor's control panel, exactly where the dog had indicated. Hands trembled slightly as bolts were unscrewed, and the dry clinks of metal echoed in the hangar, like a countdown to fate. When the final protective plate was lifted, everyone held their breath. Deep inside the main load-bearing structure was a fracture so fine it could have been mistaken for a scratch. But it wasn't. The crack wasn't on the surface, where the eye could easily spot it. It was hidden within a machine-welded alloy layer, twisting slightly along its grain, just long enough to stay intact, yet dangerous enough to turn the flight into a deadly gamble. The senior engineer's hand shook as he shone a light into the gap, then nodded gravely to his commanding officer. No further tests were needed. This was the fracture of death. At several thousand feet, if the tail rotor lost control, the aircraft would spin uncontrollably. Navigation would be impossible, and balance would be gone. No matter how skilled the pilot, there would be no saving it. With the forecasted wind shifts along today's route, even the slightest turbulence could shatter that fracture. Daniel clenched his fist as he stared at the thread-thin break in the alloy, his palm cold with dread. He turned to look at Maverick. Still seated, eyes fixed on the exact point he'd flagged, unaffected by the tension around him. No one called it luck, because this wasn't the first time. Maverick had done this before, and each time he'd been right. But this time was different. This time, it was the lives of the entire crew. Without him, Daniel might not still be standing. A pilot approached, visibly shaken. He sank to his knees beside Maverick and quietly extended a hand. Maverick didn't wag his tail or leap like a dog seeking affection. He simply placed his nose gently in the man's palm, a small act that nearly broke the old soldier's composure. "You saved me, all of us," the pilot whispered, as if confessing to a being who had seen what no machine ever could. From the edge of the maintenance bay's shadow, Ryan Denton stood motionless. He knew this was the end. No excuses left. No escape. The fracture had been found too precisely to be blamed on wear and tear. The placement, the markings, the type of stress that caused it, it was deliberate. And the only person who had access to that section during the night shift was him. No one needed to accuse him. No handcuffs were necessary. Maverick was the living indictment. He didn't need to look Ryan's way. Hours ago, Maverick had already memorized his scent, broken it down to each molecule of sweat, isolating the one that didn't belong. And now, with the fracture exposed, the saboteur's identity had begun to surface, not through accusations, but through the silent, irrefutable actions of a loyal dog. An investigator murmured, "He saved the crew just by sitting in the right place." The safety commander, who had once barked orders to clear the ramp on schedule, now bowed his head. Not out of shame, but fear. Fear that death had been closer than any of them realized, and fear that they'd nearly ignored the only warning that came in time. Maverick didn't know he was a hero. He didn't know that because of him, a major investigation would unfold, a web of sabotage would be unraveled, and a disaster a heartbeat away had been stopped. He only knew one thing: that place wasn't safe. So he spoke up. And because of that, everyone was still alive to hear the truth. After the fracture was revealed, cutting through their illusion of perfect safety like a blade, no one spoke. The familiar sounds around them, the static on the radios, the wind brushing against rotor blades, the rushed steps of technicians, suddenly felt distant, blurred beneath the weight of a moment they all knew was extraordinary. Captain Mercer, a seasoned pilot, walked slowly toward Maverick and the tail rotor. It felt like returning to the scene of a crash that never happened. He knelt before the tail joint where the crack had been found, reaching out in a slow, reverent motion. His fingers touched the edge of the damaged alloy, the spot where the metal had been subtly twisted to corrode from within. Though the fracture was barely the width of a hair, the chill that traveled from his fingertip to his heart felt like a blade, because this wasn't dead metal. This was a death postponed. Maverick stood beside him, still and silent. He watched the pilot's every move, ears upright, eyes clear as mirrors reflecting the unfiltered truth. Truth most people miss. The line between life and death, trust and doubt, logic and instinct. Daniel stood behind them, saying nothing. He knew this moment belonged to two soldiers, one who soared with his hands and one who sniffed out invisible death. Mercer laid a hand on Maverick's back, stroking gently from shoulder to spine, then resting it there. It wasn't praise. It wasn't a hollow gesture. It was acknowledgement, gratitude, a quiet surrender from a man who had trusted instruments and screens, now bowing to a creature that never gave a false alarm. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "We were lucky today, but luck shouldn't be the only reason we survive." Maverick didn't reply. He glanced at Mercer as if he heard, understood, and forgave. There was no pride in his posture, only a quiet stillness, the kind that comes from a warrior who completed his duty, not for medals but to be trusted next time, sooner, before that fragile line is crossed beyond return. Mercer stood, stepped back, and looked at the helicopter, not as a machine, but as a past nearly turned into tragedy, a past they almost failed to see because they ignored instincts, dismissed the signs, and overlooked the eyes of a dog who had once stepped back, once sat down, once stared directly at the place where metal had begun to break like a heart under pressure. "He saw what none of us did," Mercer said aloud this time, so all could hear. "Not because we were careless, but because we believed technology couldn't be wrong. But today, he saved us, not with equipment, but with loyalty and instincts that never lie." One by one, the team nodded. Pilots, officers, engineers, commanders. Quietly, honestly, they didn't need to say it. If Maverick hadn't been unleashed by Daniel, if he hadn't been trusted when he refused to board, they might not be standing there at all. Just another name in a crash report. Another silent funeral. No one knew why. Not far away, Ryan Denton stood flanked by two investigators. He had nothing left to say. No defense. He'd been sure no one would notice. Everything had been calculated. The crack hidden. The force applied just lightly enough to pass inspection. But he'd overlooked one variable. A being who didn't believe in paperwork, wasn't swayed by reports, only trusted the wind and the shift in the air. Daniel bent down and clipped the leash back onto Maverick's harness, not as a symbol of control, but of trust, a bond between two souls who didn't need words to understand each other. He whispered, like a promise, "I won't let them doubt you again." Maverick dipped his head, then walked beside Daniel toward the command tent, where the real investigation would begin. Above them, the clouds gathered, and the morning sun dimmed, like nature itself exhaling in relief after something terrible had just been narrowly avoided. On this line between life and death, it wasn't a human who made the call. It was a four-legged warrior who knew exactly when to stay silent and when to act while the world still hesitated. As Daniel clipped the leash back onto Maverick's harness, ready to leave the inspection zone, the dog didn't move. He took one deep, quiet breath, then stood still, his head tilted slightly into the wind, as if something still lingered in the air, something unresolved. The fracture had been found, the immediate danger stopped, but Maverick knew the true threat wasn't over. It wasn't in the broken alloy anymore, nor in the rotor blade. It was moving, and it knew it was about to be exposed. The early autumn breeze carried the moisture of low clouds and the heat rising from the concrete runway, mixed with the scent of engine oil, lubricant, day-old armor vests, and in that complicated blend, Maverick isolated one smell, too familiar, too clear, and too wrong to be here. He had caught it from the moment he stepped out of the vehicle that morning, the scent of someone who didn't belong to the mission, didn't belong to the trust. The scent of Ryan Denton. It was a cocktail of industrial chemicals used in metal treatment, sweat soaked through an expensive protective suit that couldn't hide tension, and the scent Maverick recognized most of all, the smell of a conscience wounded but not yet healed. He turned, quietly but decisively, walking away from Daniel and toward the maintenance zone where technicians were packing up. No one called after him. No one tried to stop him, because by now everyone understood. When Maverick left the leash on his own, he was tracking something no technology could detect. Not explosives, not a mechanical glitch, but the scent of betrayal. Ryan Denton stood among a pile of tool crates, clipboard in hand, trembling slightly. His face drained of color as he saw Maverick walking straight toward him. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, but his eyes cut through Ryan like a blade, piercing the fragile shield he'd built around his fear. Ryan bent over, pretending to check documents, but his pen slipped from a hand that could no longer finish the line. Maverick stopped 3 steps away, head low, nose skimming the ground in a slow arc, then pausing, right in the path of the wind blowing from Ryan. He inhaled deeply, held his breath a few seconds, as if reconfirming what he'd smelled earlier that day. The trace of chemical dust on gloves used for weakening metal from within without leaving a visible mark. It matched exactly the scent from the fractured rotor. There was no mistake. Maverick raised his head, stood tall, and then sat down. No sound followed, but everyone nearby froze. A young engineer whispered, "That's a live threat alert." No explanation was needed. Everyone knew what it meant. In every training drill, in every real deployment, a working dog only did this when danger involved a human, and when it sat down in front of someone, that person was the source. Daniel rushed over. He didn't ask a thing. One look at Maverick's eyes, no longer watchful but conclusive, was enough. The kind of certainty that couldn't be challenged. He turned to Ryan, voice calm but firm. "You touched the tail rotor. When? Why?" Ryan stepped back, stammering. "I was just inspecting. I'm listed in the maintenance schedule. No one is authorized to access the rotor after final assembly," Daniel replied. "Unless directly ordered by command." Maverick shifted slightly, ears up, eyes locked on Ryan's rising breaths. A security officer from Internal Investigations stepped forward, signaling to a tech behind him to pull surveillance footage from the night before. Minutes later, the radio crackled to life. "Confirmed. Ryan Denton was present in the tail rotor area at 10:13 p.m. on Tuesday. No scheduled duty, no access clearance." No one said a word. The truth didn't need language. It was standing there, on the tarmac, Under the open sky, in a circle of stunned silence, identified by a dog with no rank, no medals, but a flawless instinct. Ryan bowed his head. Sweat rolled down his back. He knew it now. He hadn't just been exposed by machines. He'd been brought down by a creature he once dismissed as just a well-trained dog. He never realized that today, that dog was the only thing standing between him and a completed crime. And Maverick still sat there, motionless, eyes fixed on the saboteur. Because he knew, metal may crack with time, but betrayal always has a scent, and Maverick was the one who never let it drift away. Just minutes after Maverick sat in front of Ryan Denton like an undeniable final verdict, the technician's face twisted, eyes flickering with panic. Then, without warning, he bolted. He pushed past the stunned engineers, darted around the back of the supply depot, and vanished into the nearby residential sprawl like a man trying to outrun everything. The investigation, the consequences, the eyes of people he could manipulate with words. But he forgot one thing. You can't escape what you can't see. The nose that had already sniffed out the truth. As radios screamed alerts and boots pounded across the tarmac, Daniel didn't wait for an order. He looked at Maverick. The dog glanced once in the direction Denton had run, then back at Daniel, as if to ask, "Now?" Daniel nodded. "Go." Maverick shot forward like lightning, weaving through the rising barricades, sprinting past the security gate before anyone could raise a hand. No GPS, no drone, no map. Just instinct. Maverick tore down the narrow streets leading away from the airbase, toward the transit hub, where city buses crossed paths, where people vanished into crowds every day. But Denton didn't understand. To Maverick, the city wasn't a maze. It was a scent map, a living canvas. Every corner, every crack held traces that a guilty man always left behind. The morning breeze swept down the avenues, carrying the scent of a man running in panic, blending with street smells, half-made coffee, damp newsprint, fresh-baked bread. But Maverick filtered them all out. There it was, faint traces of industrial chemicals, sweat driven out by adrenaline, and the sharp burn of melted plastic. Same as the rotor's tampered circuits. The city bus station opened before him like a crowded stage. Chaotic, overlapping, loud. People moving, bags dragging, horns blaring, voices calling. But Maverick didn't need ears. He only needed his nose. Head low, nose near the pavement, he slipped between shuffling feet, slicing through the crowd like a needle through torn cloth. He veered right past a corner stall, dodged a rolling suitcase to the left, then stopped. A breath. Then he turned, heading toward bus stop 6, where one bus was about to pull out, its rear door half open. Inside, Denton sat at the back, cap pulled low, backpack pressed to his chest. His hands still trembled, his eyes locked on his phone, unable to read. His shirt clung with sweat, his pulse thundered in his ears. He thought he'd escaped, thought the crowd had swallowed him, thought in one more hour he'd be gone, far from the morning's unraveling. But Maverick was already there, standing below the door. Not barking, just standing. Her nose tilted, catching every breath from the old bus vent. 1 second, 2, 3. Then he stepped forward, slowly, confidently, no longer chasing. He had found his target, and just as he had before, Maverick sat down right in front of the bus's back door, his gaze piercing the glass until it met Denton's eyes. The man turned pale. No sirens, no shouting. It was only the presence of a four-legged warrior standing firm in front of the last possible escape, his gaze relentless, refusing to let the truth slip away. The security officers arrived just a minute later, following the radio signal, tracking Daniel's GPS. But in truth, all they had to do was follow the line of civilians parting quietly to either side, whispering, "What's going on? What's that dog doing? Is he waiting for someone?" Then Daniel appeared, breathing hard, sweat soaking through the back of his shirt. But his eyes lit up the moment he saw Maverick, frozen like a stone pillar in the flow of passing strangers. He walked forward, knelt, and placed a hand gently on Maverick's shoulder. "Mav, you did it." Maverick didn't wag his tail. He didn't need to, because he knew, once again, he hadn't let evil slip away. In the chaos of a city that often felt foreign, loud, and tangled, the thing that kept truth from being buried wasn't sophisticated technology. It was a nose, a loyal heart, and an instinct that had never missed its mark. Maverick didn't need to chase the prey. He only needed to scent it, and the truth would come to light on its own. In the hallway leading to the base's interrogation room, Maverick stood silently behind a one-way mirror. Darkened glass that hid him from the inside, though he could see everything. Every twitch, every flicker of an eye avoiding contact, every uneven breath of the man who had traded an entire crew's safety for something far more despicable. Maverick made no sound. He didn't need to. The air around him felt heavier, thickened into a silence that everyone inside the room could feel, though none could explain. Because they all knew this was where the final truth would be uncovered. Not by force, not by threats, but by the gaze of a creature who had never spoken a word. Ryan Denton sat in the middle of the interrogation room, his wrists cuffed, his body drawn inward beneath the cold glare of the fluorescent lights above. Hours earlier, he had walked onto the base with arrogance, an experienced technician, more familiar with the system than some junior officers. He had believed that with the right tools, the right calibration, he could pass off a calculated sabotage as just another, unfortunate mechanical failure. Walk away clean, untouched. But he hadn't planned for a pair of eyes staring at him through the glass, eyes that refused to look away. Maverick knew nothing of bribery, greed, or corporate betrayal, but he knew the smell of fear. He recognized the kind of sweat that didn't belong in that room. The scent released when secrets start to unravel. The scent of a man whose lies were breaking apart the way he had fractured the rotor. More than scent, Maverick sensed the rhythm of breath that stuttered, the eyes that couldn't land anywhere but the cold metal table in front of him. The lead investigator rested his hand on a file, reciting entries one by one. Denton's presence in the hangar, the unauthorized badge scan, security footage timestamps, statements from engineers. But all of it was background for what he said next. "We don't need a confession, Denton. Not if you're not ready. But I want you to understand. That dog, he's never wrong." That was when Ryan froze. His jaw dropped slightly. His shoulders slumped as if someone had ripped out his spine. He didn't look up, but his fingers clenched tightly together, trembling. He whispered, barely audible, "He's been watching me since morning, never looked away. He knows I didn't do the right thing." Outside, Daniel heard every word through the earpiece. He glanced down at Maverick, still motionless, still watching, not like a predator cornering prey, but like a warrior who had already seen the truth. Not through evidence, but through instinct forged over years, standing between life and death. Denton's voice cracked. He began to speak, quiet at first, then louder as the last of his facade crumbled. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I just wanted them to think the chopper wasn't reliable, just a minor failure, just enough to get them to call me back to need me again. I didn't think it would be this dangerous." Silence. Then he folded forward, shoulders shaking, like a man whose soul had nowhere left to hide. He wasn't afraid of the handcuffs. He wasn't afraid of prison. He was afraid of the one thing that couldn't be scrubbed clean. The gaze of a dog who had seen what the world wasn't supposed to. The investigator nodded, signaling for the confession to be recorded. The light in the room dimmed slightly, and in the misty reflection of the one-way glass, Maverick's figure remained unmoved, as though he hadn't shifted since the moment he arrived. Daniel leaned down, hand resting gently on Maverick's back, his voice low and warm. "It's done, Mav. You just did something none of us could. Not by force, not by interrogation, just by seeing." Maverick exhaled quietly. No tail wag, no retreat. Still watching, because in Maverick's world, the truth doesn't need to be spoken. It just needs to be seen, until the one hiding it no longer dares to look away. And those eyes, the ones that had once stared down death on minefields and battlefields, had again proven some truths can't be measured by logic, only faced by the silent honesty of a four-legged warrior. After the fractured confession shattered in the interrogation room, the atmosphere across the base seemed to pause, not from shock, but because the truth had emerged so quietly, so clearly, that no one could bring themselves to doubt it anymore. The investigator stared at the file in his hands, where entries, schedules, and technical data suddenly read more like an indictment, not just against Denton, but against a system being manipulated from behind closed doors. Less than an hour after Denton's attempted escape, Internal Affairs teamed up with State Security to expand the investigation. They traced Denton's recent financial activity and found suspicious transfers from a third party, a consulting firm specializing in aviation equipment, located 2 states away. It was the same firm that had lost the helicopter maintenance bid 6 months prior. Emails that once seemed benign, personnel records with hidden redactions, and payment logs under false names began to reveal a deliberate plot. Sabotage, designed not to kill, but to erode confidence in the unit overseeing security for high-ranking officials. They didn't want blood. They didn't want casualties. They wanted doubt. A single incident. A technical hiccup just big enough to shake faith and force the government to reconsider the contract they had lost. And Denton, once a technician here, quietly dismissed after a string of violations, was the perfect pawn to create the first crack. But they hadn't accounted for Maverick. In dozens of flowcharts, altered schedules, and contingency plans, there wasn't a single mention of detection by a dog. To them, Maverick was decoration, part of the PR package, a symbol of professionalism. No one sitting at that cold strategy table ever imagined that the animal could smell altered metal, or the guilt clinging to the skin of the saboteur. In the emergency command center, the links lit up across the big screen. Denton, transaction, middleman, failed contractor, disgraced advisor. Daniel stared at the web of connections, a cold weight in his chest. He had believed in a system too tight to be manipulated, in missions guarded by perfection. But now, he faced the truth. Even the strongest structure could fall, if just one person decided to rot it from within. And at the center of all this, the only one without a rank, without a uniform, without a seat at the table, was the one who had seen what everyone else missed. Maverick. He lay quietly at Daniel's feet, still, eyes open, watching the screen. Not to process its data, but to sense what humans had forgotten. Instinct. He didn't know about bids, or contracts, or corporate vendettas, but he knew where something was off. He stopped where the metal lost its integrity. He backed away when the air pressure changed. And he sat down when his gut told him something had been hidden behind polished steel and perfect protocol. Officer Keller stepped in, holding a preliminary report. His voice was no longer sharp like that morning, but subdued, like a man realizing how close he had come to sacrificing his team's lives to a rushed decision. The inspection system didn't catch it. The sensors gave no alerts. We ran 3 checks. But Keller looked down at Maverick. He didn't need a report, just took a step, and chose not to take another. Daniel knelt and gently stroked behind Maverick's ear, still warm from that windless morning before everything began. He always does, Daniel whispered, almost to himself. Sees what we're too slow to catch. The room went quiet. Not out of fear, not out of gratitude, because what they had just witnessed defied logic. A calculated conspiracy, with funding, with strategy, with a clear objective, had been stopped not by law, not by any system, but by loyalty-driven instinct, the kind of instinct humans had almost forgotten, lost in the whirl of protocols, spreadsheets, and suspicion. And at the center of it all was Maverick. No medals were pinned to his chest, no victory speech, no grand gestures, just a dog sitting still, with eyes that had once stared down fire and fear, and now had seen straight through metal and into the heart of a man. The conspiracy was exposed. The perpetrator arrested, and life protected because a dog knew when to stop. After the official report on the sabotage was submitted, the base quietly shifted into its post-incident phase, a tense limbo where no one's expression had truly relaxed, even though the immediate threat had passed. Internal lines buzzed with non-stop calls. Officer Keller was pulled into an emergency briefing with state officials. Mercer and the flight crew were grounded for 48 hours for psychological monitoring. Denton had already been escorted to solitary holding, awaiting formal charges. But amid all the human activity, at the quiet edge of the tarmac, Maverick hadn't moved. The sky had turned gray late that morning, but no one expected the storm to arrive so quickly. It began with gusts of wind ripping through the signage. Then came the first drops on the hangar roof. Light at first, then pounding sheets that erased the lines of the runway. Radar reported severe, low-level wind shear. Flights were postponed indefinitely. The airport system went into equipment protection mode, and all personnel were ordered to retreat indoors. But Maverick didn't retreat. Under the narrow awning behind the helicopter hangar, where yellow floodlights glinted off the rain like scattered silver dust, he stood, ears erect, eyes focused beyond the curtain of rain, as if a battlefield lay just out of sight, and he couldn't afford to look away for even a second. Daniel had called him twice, the first time with an old training command, the second simply, Mav, just like on those quiet patrol nights. But Maverick didn't look, didn't budge. He didn't behave like a dog caught in the rain, because he wasn't sheltering. He was standing guard. A passing soldier chuckled. He still thinks he's on duty. Daniel heard it but didn't correct him. He understood better than anyone. Maverick never saw duty as flying or waiting for commands. His mission was to sense, to protect, to stand where no human could see, holding the peace without needing credit. As the wind howled, as rain hammered against fuel tanks and metal walls like distant war drums, Maverick stood motionless, a breathing statue carved into the cold backdrop of the base, the embodiment of unwavering loyalty. Daniel walked over, pulling his jacket tighter against the wind, then knelt beside him. Rain had soaked the bottom of his pants. Wind lashed at his neck, raising goosebumps down his spine. But he didn't leave. How could he, when this companion, this shield, had just stood between him and death hours earlier? He rested his hand on Maverick's back. The dog remained upright, but turned his head slightly, glancing at Daniel, not to ask, but to confirm, "You're still here?" Daniel nodded softly. "No words are needed. I'm here, and I'll stay. With you, until the storm passes." Sometimes the saboteur is a person. Sometimes the storm is a mechanical failure. But sometimes the storm comes from arrogance itself, the belief that technology is flawless, that systems can account for everything. And it's in those moments, in the thin cracks between trust and danger, that a dog chose not to board, chose to step back, and then sit down. No thunder was needed to scare him. Maverick had heard worse. Explosions, gunfire, the scream of twisted metal. He wasn't afraid. And because he wasn't afraid, he always knew exactly when to stand. And where. Daniel pulled his jacket up over Maverick's shoulders, covering the slight tremble beginning to ripple down his back. "This morning, no one's going to forget that, Mav," he whispered. "But even if they do, I won't. I never will." A raindrop landed in Maverick's eye. He blinked gently, then kept looking forward. Because to him, peace wasn't something guaranteed by a signature. It was something that had to be guarded second by second, storm by storm. And no matter how wild the skies turned, Maverick would still be there, not to win, but to protect. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky streaked with the soft gold of late afternoon sunlight, just bright enough to glint off the metallic skin of the helicopter still resting quietly under the hangar roof, as if the entire base had paused to take a deep breath after everything it had endured. A conspiracy exposed, a disaster averted. Dozens of lives were reserved because a dog chose not to move forward. No sirens, no drama, no need for spectacular chases or tactical mind games, Just one steady gaze, one halted step, one breath stirred the conscience of an entire unit. And now the base entered a rare and unprecedented moment, a silent ceremony of recognition. There was no public announcement, no cameras, no press, just a small room adjacent to the operations command center, bathed in warm amber light. The scent of machine oil still lingered faintly on soldiers' boots, and the air carried the quiet echo of days that once seemed too routine to ever need something extraordinary. Daniel led Maverick inside, his hand resting gently on the dog's back, as always. Maverick's paws tapped lightly against the tile floor, but to those standing along either wall, Mercer, Keller, Peterson, engineers, pilots, and coordinators, it felt as if something had shifted in their chests. Not because Maverick was the first K-9 to receive the unit's highest honor, but because they all knew, if it weren't for him, they wouldn't be standing here at all. Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, tasked with speaking on behalf of the team, stepped forward holding a small wooden box. Plain, no red velvet, no gold trim, but polished with the same care as a commander's boots before a parade. He didn't say much. He simply knelt to Maverick's level, opened the box, and revealed something that made the room collectively hold its breath. A challenge coin, one never before minted for a four-legged soldier. On one side was the emblem of the Airborne Security Unit, a pair of wings enclosed in a compass circle, symbolizing direction, resolve, and the ability to uncover truth no matter where it hides. On the reverse, engraved by hand, were the words, "For the silence that saved lives." Beneath it, Maverick, K90172, date of recognition, preserving life, stopping the darkness. Peterson spoke slowly. No speech, no list of accomplishments, just a steady gaze into Maverick's calm, clear eyes as he said, "We have radars to scan the skies. We have metal analyzers, vibration sensors, but none of them saw what you saw, and you never looked away, even when we all did." He handed the coin to Daniel. Not like a reward, but as if returning something that had always belonged to Maverick. Daniel accepted it, then knelt beside his partner. He didn't pin it on right away. He simply held it out for Maverick to sniff, to examine, as they always did with things that mattered. Weapons, signals, the order to stop. Maverick leaned forward, took in a quiet breath, then turned his head to look at Daniel. He didn't lick his hand. He didn't wag his tail. Just a single look, deep, steady, enough to say he understood. This wasn't a prize. It was proof of something greater than himself. Daniel fastened the coin to the left side of Maverick's harness, right next to the reflective police patch that had been with him through hundreds of missions. Then, Daniel lowered his head down until his forehead touched Maverick's. A rare gesture, never taught in training, but one that had long become their silent ritual. No words were exchanged, but everyone watching felt their breath catch. Because only they knew. Some things go beyond recognition. Unspoken trust, the first time Daniel disobeyed a superior's command to trust a single look, a single step back, a silent refusal to move forward. And now, as teammates stood in reverent silence before Maverick, no one questioned anything anymore. No one thought, "He's just a dog." An older officer whispered to a colleague, "If all our sensors were as sharp as he is, maybe the world would be at peace." The other man simply nodded, and Maverick, as if sensing the weight of their silence, nuzzled his nose into Daniel's sleeve, then lifted his head again, ears alert, eyes open, as if already listening for the next storm. For him, honor wasn't found in medals, but in silence held at the right moment, in the courage to stand still when no one else believed, and in loyalty that never wavered, even in a world spinning with doubt. And today, that dog, the soldier who never spoke, made an entire unit rise in silence out of respect. As the ceremony ended, people quietly filed out of the room, their steps slower than usual. No loud voices, no backslaps or laughter like in typical mission debriefings, because everyone understood. What had just happened wasn't a victory to be celebrated, but a quiet reminder of something deeply old, almost forgotten, that sometimes life is preserved not by technology, but by trust. Maverick still sat beside Daniel, his gaze calm, following each person as they left. Not with urgency, not seeking praise. He didn't need applause. His real reward had come long before the ceremony. It came at the moment Daniel unclipped his leash, amid doubt from the entire unit, and said simply, "Go find it, Mav." Mercer was the last to remain. A veteran pilot who had spent half his life in cockpits, who had trusted pressure gauges, rotor readouts, vibration sensors, now stood quietly in front of a dog. He wasn't silent out of hesitation, but because he didn't know where to begin. To most, Mercer was the definition of a hard realist, someone who believed in machines over hunches, and who had never once delayed a flight because something didn't feel right. But that day, he'd nearly taken off with a rotor already fractured from within. He stepped closer and knelt, meeting Maverick at eye level. His flight suit was still damp from the earlier storm, and his eyes were red from a sleepless night. Slowly, without force or awkwardness, he extended his hand, rough and weathered from years of flight, holding it just in front of Maverick's muzzle, and spoke in a quiet, gravelly voice. "Next time I'll ask you before I take off." Maverick didn't bark, didn't lean in, and didn't back away. He simply moved an inch closer, inhaled gently from the palm, sensing the sweat, the engine grease, the lingering trace of adrenaline. And then, in a rare gesture that had never happened between the two before, Maverick lowered his head and gave a single soft lick across the back of Mercer's hand. Not long, not wet, but just enough to touch the skin of a man shaped by war and storms. With trust. It wasn't forgiveness. Maverick didn't hold grudges. But trust wasn't something he gave back easily, either. It was a promise. A promise that if Mercer could learn to listen, not just through radar, but through instinct, if he could trust the ears that perked up in the storm, the pause just before the ramp, the moment of stillness that said more than any sensor could, then Maverick, as he had always done, would continue to stand guard, with his nose, his gaze, and silence. Mercer nodded, slowly. Not the nod of a commanding officer, but of a man relearning an old truth, a lesson in intuition, in survival, in trust that reaches beyond anything measurable. He rose, adjusted the strap on his flight suit, then turned to Daniel and let out a dry, soft laugh. "Funny," he said hoarsely. "I've spent my whole life trusting numbers. Turns out the thing that saved me was a scent." Daniel didn't laugh. He just placed his hand on Maverick's back and answered plainly, "He doesn't need theory, just someone willing to listen." And from that day forward, before every flight where Maverick was present, whether a high-alert mission or a routine patrol, Mercer walked a full circle around the helicopter with the dog. Not as protocol, but to wait, to meet Maverick's eyes. If the dog didn't sit, didn't back away, didn't hesitate, the flight would proceed. Among million-dollar instruments, between control panels and wind charts, Mercer had learned to seek guidance from a creature who never spoke, but never once gave the wrong answer. And Maverick, just as he had since the day he was pulled from a shelter, since his very first step onto that base, kept signaling not through words, not through noise, but through scent, through instinct, and through a kind of trust that required no response. Because to him, it wasn't a gift. It was his nature, his purpose. And if even one person is willing to sit still, listen to the wind, and wait for a quiet lick on the hand, a promise made without words, then maybe this world, though still uncertain, gains one more chance to survive. A few days after that quiet ceremony, as the base slowly returned to its usual rhythm, the skies had cleared, the winds softened, and the storm was now just a fading note in the weather logs. Mercer received word. The new helicopter, the one replacing the aircraft that had almost flown them into death's hands, was fully assembled and ready for its first test flight. The engineers had triple-checked every system. The control panel showed no faults. The rotor sensors and circuit diagnostics were all within perfect limits. But despite every instrument signaling, "Ready," Mercer turned to Daniel and said just one thing. "I'm not taking off until Maverick checks it." No one questioned it. No one argued. Because after everything, the only one who had kept them from falling into the trap of fractured metal wasn't a sensor. It was a nose. And a step that never moved forward. Maverick walked out onto the tarmac with calm, unhurried steps. Not tense, not on alert. Because today, nothing was hiding. No deceptive scent trying to mask danger. Daniel unclipped his leash a few meters from the aircraft, and without instruction, Maverick approached the new helicopter like a seasoned mechanic stepping into his workshop. He circled the polished Bell model, its frame reflecting the pale sunlight. Each step was paired with a deep breath, nose gliding along the rivets, the joints, the hinges, methodical, precise, and never for show. Mercer stood a few steps away, hands clasped behind his back, eyes locked on every movement like a soldier waiting for a field report from a trusted comrade. He did not attempt to hide his tension, despite having flown through hundreds of takeoffs and landings. Because this time, the "cleared for takeoff" didn't come from a tower. It came from a dog who had once grounded an aircraft with nothing but silence. Maverick made his way toward the tail, the same spot where the disaster had almost started. He didn't linger. Just one slow inhale. No strange chemical trace. No off-standard oil. No wrongness. That subtle, nameless scent Daniel once called the smell of something not yet broken but not quite right. There was nothing. He turned back. He walked to the midsection of the aircraft, an area no one would have guessed as the place to stop, then sat. Smooth, steady. His tail brushed the ground as he lifted his head and locked eyes with Mercer. No bark, no warning, no doubt. Just a gaze, calm and clear, as if to say, "It's safe." Mercer stepped forward, slowly, and knelt to Maverick's level. His eyes shimmered, not just from sunlight. He reached out, his hand no longer trembling like before, and spoke softly, barely a whisper. "Thank you, Maverick. Now I finally believe we fly because you're still here on the ground." Daniel stepped in, gently clipped the leash back onto Maverick's harness, and gave his back 2 light taps, a signal that had become their unspoken ritual. "Good job. We're done." Maverick didn't wag his tail too hard. He didn't ask for more. He simply stood, glanced back once at the helicopter, one last confirmation, and then walked toward Daniel, the challenge coin now gleaming on his harness, the engraved name catching the sunlight like a quiet badge of honor. As the flight crew began startup procedures and the rotors stirred the air, Mercer sat in the pilot seat, hand resting on the controls. But before he did anything, he glanced out the cockpit window, toward Maverick, still standing beside Daniel, eyes meeting his one last time. Mercer nodded. The flight began, and this time everyone knew. The aircraft didn't take off just because the system said so. It took off because a dog had smelled peace in the wind. That afternoon, after the helicopter returned from a flawless flight that felt as if doubt had never touched it, Daniel and Maverick left the base in their familiar patrol SUV, rolling gently through golden late-day sunlight, stretching across buildings and damp runways. A soft breeze slipped through the open window, carrying the scent of dry grass and hot asphalt, rising from the pavement. Mundane to most, but to Maverick, it was a living map of the world. Every gust held a story only he could read. He lay quietly in the back seat, head resting on Daniel's leg, eyes closed as if asleep, though his ears flicked gently with every passing sound. The distant laugh of a child, a snippet of radio from another car, the soft skid of tires over a pothole. He didn't need to look to know what was happening, because sometimes understanding doesn't come from watching. It comes from listening in stillness. Daniel glanced into the rearview mirror and saw the face that had been beside him through so many missions, the face that had sat silently next to him when everything felt like it was falling apart, the same face that once turned away when it sensed something wrong, when everyone else looked in the opposite direction. The SUV passed through a small neighborhood where amber streetlights flickered on beneath rows of flame trees. Daniel rolled the window down slightly, let the air brush against his hand, while the other rested gently on Maverick's back, tapping softly. A conversation without words. He thought of everything. The fractured rotor, the uncovered plot, the lives saved by a single unwavering look. He thought of Mercer's stubbornness, Keller's early doubt, the eyes that once saw Maverick as just a tool, not a soul who felt. Then he smiled, eyes turning to the road again, voice soft. Not really to anyone, not quite to himself. He doesn't need to speak, doesn't need a weapon, doesn't need a badge. He just needs to be trusted, and he'll save the world if he has to. In the back seat, a slight twitch of the ears, as if Maverick had heard. He didn't open his eyes. He simply let out a long, quiet breath, then nestled his head more deeply into Daniel's lap. A gesture simple but weighted, understood only by those who've laid side by side with life and death. To the world, he was a canine dog. To the press, he was a four-legged hero. To the unit, a symbol. But to Daniel, the man who first saw him through the bars of a shelter kennel, nothing but skin and bones, yet still lifting his head to meet Daniel's gaze, Maverick wasn't an it. He was someone, a soul, a comrade, a soldier on four legs, but with a heart stronger than any who'd walked the battlefield. The vehicle rolled farther from the base, toward the soft glow of peace returning at last. It was over, but Maverick never truly went off duty. For him, every breath was intuition, every heartbeat a silent alarm, every step a vow. I'm here to protect, even if no one knows I'm doing it. And Daniel, the man who once guided Maverick through missions with voice and hand, now knew one truth more than any other. He didn't lead this dog. He simply walked beside him, with all the respect a silent warrior deserves. The sky deepened into amber, and within that fading light, a patrol SUV moved gently past. Inside it, a quiet man and a four-legged soul, sleeping peacefully in the glow of unshakable trust. In a world increasingly reliant on technology and numbers, Maverick's story reminds us of a powerful truth. Sometimes, what saves a life isn't the blare of a siren or the complexity of a circuit board, but the quiet presence of a four-legged soul who knows how to listen to the things humans have long learned to ignore. No need for language, no need for commands, just a look, a step back, and unwavering trust. So what about you? If you were Daniel, would you have the courage to trust a dog's instinct when everyone around you insists, "There's nothing wrong"? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories and reflections. If Maverick's story touched your heart, please hit like, share this video with those who love animals and believe in the strength of loyalty, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss more moving stories about silent heroes. We'll be back soon with more stories to remind you that there's still something good in this world.